I pick up my life and take it with me, and I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Harlem, any place that is north and east and not Dixie. I pick up my life and take it on the train to Los Angeles, Bakersfield, Seattle, Oakland, Salt Lake, any place that is north and west and not south. I am fed up with Jim Crow laws, people who are cruel and afraid, who lynch and run, who are scared of me and me of them. So I pick up my life and take it away on a one-way ticket, gone up north, gone out west, gone. When I was 13 years old, my mother moved to a town called Lincoln, Illinois. I was in the 8th grade grammar school. At that time, we didn't have junior high school, so when you graduated from the 8th grade, you went to high school. In this 8th grade graduating class in Lincoln, Illinois, on the day that I entered, the students were talking about holding a class election. It seems that they'd heard that the high school across the street had class officers, so they wanted to have officers too. Well, the teacher was explaining to the class that day the duties of class officers. She said, of course, that the president had to know how to run a meeting, and the secretary had to know how to write, and so on. And then when she got to the office of class poet, she stressed rhythm. She said a poem must have rhythm. Well, now, I was a stranger in the class. I'd entered about 4 weeks after the school year had begun. I didn't know any of the other pupils. They didn't know me. I was one of 2 Negro children in that class. I didn't expect to be elected to any class office, being new there, you know. And besides, on the way home from school that day, the one other Negro pupil, a girl, told me that she never heard of colored children being elected to anything in the schools there in Lincoln, Illinois. She said, this is a prejudiced little town. Well, she was just about right. It was a kind of American small town that, at that time, did not permit Negroes to eat in any of the restaurants downtown. If you were colored and you went to the movies, you had to sit in the last row on the left. If that single row was crowded that night, you couldn't go to the movies if you were a Negro. Well, the next day when the class election was held, sure enough, all of the officers were nominated and voted upon and elected, except one office, and the colored girl who'd been in the class all the 8 terms with the other pupils was not nominated or elected to anything. And of course, my name wasn't mentioned. But when they got on to the very last office, down at the very bottom of the blackboard, underneath Sergeant-at-Arms even, that was the office of class poet. And there weren't any nominations at all. The pupils looked around at each other, and it seemed that nobody in the class looked like a poet. Nobody even looked like he or she could write a poem, so the problem was who to nominate for class poet. The teacher said, you do want a class poet, don't you? And all the youngsters said, well, yes, we do. And she said, well, you have to nominate somebody. So finally, a little white boy got up and turned around and looked at me and called my name. And right away, the whole class said, unanimously, I was elected the class poet. Well, I thought that was just because nobody else wanted the office. But in thinking about it that night a little more carefully, I remembered that the teacher the day before, in defining what a poet had to possess, had stressed the word rhythm. And I knew that, in my experience, almost all American white people at that time seemed to think that all Negroes could sing and dance and that all of us had a sense of rhythm, sort of conventional belief, you know. So I came to the conclusion that maybe poetry, rhythm, color, me, a Negro, that little boy had thought he must have some rhythm to give a poem, and maybe that's why I was elected the class poet. At any rate, I'm glad that I was. Up to that time, I had not really thought about writing in any serious way at all. Although my mother liked poetry, she used to recite poetry a great deal. In fact, she used to make me recite poems on church programs and school programs when I was little. And I must say I didn't like it very much, having to stand up in public and say rhymes. But when I began to work on my class poem, and I had all winter to write it, you know, it wasn't due till graduation in the spring, I began to sort of take an interest in reading poetry. My class poem turned out to be just about the longest poem I've ever written, even up to now. It was 16 verses long. I had 8 for the class and 8 for our teachers, because we had 8 teachers in the school. Well, it's a wonder anybody likes it, but when I stood up and read the poem at graduation in June, everybody applauded very loudly, and I was so pleased by all that applause that ever since that time I've been writing poetry. Now, of course, that wouldn't be too unusual today, but when I was in high school 40 years ago, it seemed that most teachers liked only poets who had lived 100 or 200 years before their students were born. You know, poets like Keats and Shelley and Longfellow and Browning and Byron. But this particular teacher, Ethel Weimer was her name, would read to her classes from living poets. She read to us from Carl Sandburg, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Edgar Lee Masters, Rachel Lindsay, and I began to see that poetry could have some connection with life. The poet that I particularly liked during my high school days was Carl Sandburg. And so when I began to try to write poems seriously, I tried to write like Sandburg. Sandburg at that time had just published his first book. He was being attacked by most of the literary critics as radical, as too far out, as extreme. He didn't use rhyme. Free verse, as his poetry was termed, was considered almost like abstract painting was in the 20s and 30s, you know? Well, nevertheless, I like Sandburg. Perhaps I liked him because he wrote about things that I knew about. He wrote about the wheat fields of the Middle West. He wrote about the steel mills in cities like Cleveland and Chicago, where my stepfather worked. He wrote about the slums. He wrote about poor people. Then the other poetic influence was that of Paul Laurence Dunbar. Dunbar was a very famous Negro poet at the turn of the century. He died about the time that I was born, but when I was a child, almost every Negro home had a book of Dunbar's poetry, and I had sort of grown up on Dunbar. Well, now, Dunbar wasn't like Sandburg at all in style. He wrote in a sort of singing, rhymed verse, quite a deal of humor in his poetry, very often in the quaint Negro dialect of the post-Civil War period. Now, in trying to write like both Sandburg and Dunbar, it's a wonder I didn't fall between two stools. But both of them certainly influenced my thinking and my poetic styles. My earliest serious poem to be published was a poem called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I wrote this poem when I was 18, wrote it on a train going to Mexico just after I'd graduated from high school. My father lived in Mexico City. On the train, as we crossed the Mississippi River just outside St. Louis, sunset time, I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what it had meant to the Negro people in the past. How in slavery time, to be sold down the Mississippi was, I'd heard, the worst thing that could happen to a slave, because if they sent you down into the rice fields, into the Delta, the hot regions around New Orleans, you might not live very long. And then I remembered reading that Abraham Lincoln, as a young man, had gone down the Mississippi. He'd seen the slave market in New Orleans, the buying and selling of human beings, and he never forgot it. It was Lincoln who, many years later, signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the black slaves. And so these thoughts went into this poem of mine that I wrote down on this train shortly after we'd gone across this river in the sunset. And from Mexico City, I sent the poem to a Negro magazine called The Crisis, the organ of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I went to Columbia University in New York City for a year. I didn't like Columbia very well. a big university in the very heart of a big city. It didn't seem to me to have what I thought was a feeling of college life or campus life. And then, at that time, there was prejudice at Columbia. I had difficulty getting a room in the dormitory as a Negro student. And then, being interested in writing, I wanted to become a member of the staff of the Columbia College newspaper, The Spectator. And so I tried out for it. You had to go through sort of preliminary test and show some ability. And do you know what they assigned me to? Me, a Negro student, they assigned me to society and fraternity news. And they knew very well that I had no access to most of the fraternity houses or dances that the white students went to. And so I was unsuccessful in making the staff of The Spectator. My father had wanted me to become a mining engineer. By that time, I'd made up my mind that I'd like to be a writer. We didn't agree on objectives. So at the end of the year, I wrote my father in Mexico City and told him that I had decided to try to be a writer, and if he didn't approve of my plans, he needn't send me any more money. Well, he didn't send me any more money. I found myself in New York City with only $13 at the end of my college year, and that is what I started out in life on. Ever since that time, I've been making my own living, and with this $13, I went down to Harlem, got a room, and began to look for a job. Here on the edge of hell stands Harlem, remembering the old lies, the old kicks in the back, the old be patient they told us before. Sure, we remember. Now, when the man at the corner store says sugar's gone up another 2 cents and bread 1, and there's a new tax on cigarettes, we remember the job we never had, never could get, and can't have now because we're colored. So we stand here on the edge of hell in Harlem and look out on the world and wonder what we're going to do in the face of what we remember. I eventually found work on the boats, so I went to sea. I made a trip to Africa, all up and down the West Coast. It was there that I saw the meaning of colonialism, because at that time, of course, almost all of Africa belonged to the great European powers. After working on the boats for about 2 years, I decided one day in Rotterdam that I'd like to see Paris. And I thought perhaps I'd better go see Paris right then and there, because I was working on a rusty old tub of a ship that didn't seem to me very seaworthy. The ocean was extremely rough that winter, and I thought, well, I'll get off and go see Paris. I had only $25 coming to me. I drew it. I bought a ticket to Paris, got on the train in Rotterdam around midnight, got to Paris at 7 o'clock in the morning, cold, snowy, February morning. I didn't know a soul in all of Europe. But I thought I knew French pretty well because I'd had 3 years French in high school and I'd had a year at Columbia. But it turned out that when I tried my French out in the cafe of the Gare du Nord in Paris that morning when I got off the train being hungry, asked for some breakfast, I said, Donnez-moi des oufs, s'il vous plaît, du jambon. They looked at me and didn't give me anything. I was asking for ham and eggs, and I didn't realize the French don't eat ham and eggs anyway for breakfast. Then I began to realize that what I was saying didn't penetrate the French ear, so I saw some nice rolls right in front of me on the counter. The coffee urn was bubbling, so I pointed to the coffee urn, I pointed at the rolls, and right away I got coffee and rolls. So I learned that you can get almost anything you want anywhere in the world just by using sign language. That is, you can get almost anything except a job. Finally, I got work as a doorman in a nightclub. The salary was your dinner and tips. Well, I was delighted just to have the dinner, so I would go to work especially early in order to eat, and I would work all night standing outside this door and hailing taxis for people. I found out, however, that Paris, like Chicago, has or had at that time a certain gangster element, and it turned out that I was working at a gangster nightclub. They had a great many fights inside. They fought in all sorts of languages, very seldom in English, and I, as doorman, would be called upon to come inside and stop the fights. So I didn't stay there very long. I finally found another job in another nightclub, a club called the Grand Duke, right in the middle of Montmartre. I was employed as a second cook. Well, since I couldn't cook anything, fortunately for me, the title second cook really meant dishwasher. And so, washing pots and pans every night in the kitchen of the Grand Duke, I used to hear the jazz band playing outside in the cabaret part. They had a very good jazz combination from New York. Negro musicians like the drummer Buddy Gilmore played there. Kaiser Marshall sometimes was on drums too. And so this excellent little band began to draw quite a few people to this club. People like the Prince of Wales, who is now the Duke of Windsor, used to come. And from Hollywood, Anita Loos and movie actress Gloria Swanson. It was a very nice club. Eventually, they brought Bricktop there as the hostess, and she began her European career in this little club called the Grand Duke. I remember she arrived one night just off the boat from Le Havre, absolutely penniless, because someone had stolen her pocketbook on the pier. And so Brick really began her international career without a cent. Well, while she was singing outside in the club, I would be washing dishes in the kitchen and sometimes thinking out a poems that the critics called jazz poems. So my poetic career is really all tied up with dishwashing in this little club called the Grand Duke. The Negro with the trumpet at his lips has dark moons of weariness beneath his eyes, where the smoldering memory of slave ships blaze to the crack of whips about his thighs. The Negro with the trumpet at his lips has a head of vibrant hair tamed down, patent leathered now until it gleams like jet, were jet a crown. The music from the trumpet at his lips is honey mixed with liquid fire. The rhythm from the trumpet at his lips is ecstasy distilled from old desire. Desire that is longing for the moon, where the moonlight's but a spotlight in his eyes. Desire that is longing for the sea, where the seas are bar glass, sucker size. The Negro with the trumpet at his lips, whose jacket has a fine one-button roll, does not know upon what riff the music slips its hypodermic needle to his soul. But softly, as the tune comes from his throat, trouble mellows to a golden note. The very first poem that I sold was a jazz poem. It was a poem about the Charleston. The Charleston was the dance that had begun at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, spread to Broadway, was brought to Europe first by Josephine Baker, and then went all around the world. Well, this little Charleston poem of mine and two others I sent to a magazine called Vanity Fair. That was a very smart New York magazine at that time, and they bought these three poems, and they paid me 50 cents a line. But my three poems were quite short, and when I got the check and looked at it, wasn't very much money. So I thought to myself, well, from now on, I'll cut all my poetic lines in half and make two out of them and get bigger checks. So now you understand when you see my poems having very short lines, how I became aware of the value of shortening the line in poetry. Commercial reasons. I sort of went backwards from an interest in jazz to an interest in the folk roots of jazz. I went backwards from jazz to the blues, and the blues really are the basis of jazz, and to the spirituals, the great Negro folk songs of the slave period. And having tried to write poems in the syncopated idiom of jazz, I then began to try to write poems in the folk idiom of the blues and the spirituals. These poems, my blues poems particularly, seem to attract considerable attention. My first book, published by Alfred Aikenoff, was called The Weary Blues, and ever since that time, I've written a number of poems as nearly as I can make them in the exact form of the Negro folk blues. The spirituals, of course, have no strict poetic form. There are some very beautiful lyrics in some of the spirituals, But no single spiritual lyric will be very much like another as a rule. The blues, however, do have a strict poetic form. The blues form is one long line repeated and a third line that rhymes with the first two. And of course, the musical form of the blues is usually that of 12 bars. This is a folk blues that I remember from my childhood. I'm going down to the railroad and lay my head on the track. Going down to the railroad, lay my head on the track. If I see the train a-comin', I'll jerk it back. Well, now, you see, the form of the blues, the three lines, the mood of the blues is certainly clearly indicated there. Sadness, but a little twist somewhere in the thought, somewhere in the verse to make people smile, sometimes even to make you laugh. And I think it's this quality of sadness mingled with humor that has come from the blues into jazz and that causes that music to be loved all around the world. The blues, unlike the spirituals, which are group songs, or were originally certainly group songs, congregational church songs, religious songs sung by many people banded together at camp meetings or prayer meetings. The blues, on the other hand, are individual songs. They're usually sung by one man or one woman alone. And therefore you can sort of classify the blues as masculine and feminine in theme, because the men's blues are almost always about being out of work, broke, hungry, maybe a long ways from home, no ticket to get back. In other words, they're sort of economic blues. The women's blues, on the other hand, are almost always about love. Very often a woman will be singing about some man who's gone off and left her before she's ready for him to go, or something like that. I went to the Gypsies. Gypsy sitting all alone. I said, tell me, Gypsy, when will my gal be home? Gypsy said, silver, put some silver in my hand, and I'll look into the future and tell you all I can. I crossed her palm with silver, then she started in to lie. She said, now listen, mister, she'll be here by and by. Oh, what a lie. I've been waiting and a-waiting, and she ain't come home yet. Something must have happened to make my gal forget. I hates a lying gypsy. Will take good money from you. Tell you pretty stories and take your money from you. But if I was a gypsy, I would take your money too. Listen, kid Sleepy, don't you want to run around to the other side of the house where the shade is? It's sunny here and your skin'll turn a reddish purple in the sun. Kid Sleepy said, I don't care. Listen, Kid Sleepy, don't you want to get up and go to work downtown somewhere to earn enough for lunches and car fare? Kid Sleepy said, I don't care. Or would you rather, Kid Sleepy, just stay here? Rather just stay here. Miss Gardner's in her garden. Miss Yardman's in her yard. Miss Michaelmas is at the mass, and I'm getting tired. Lord, I'm getting tired. The nations they is fighting and the nations they done fit. Sometimes I think that white folks ain't worth a little bit. No, ma'am, ain't worth a little bit. Last week, they lynched a colored boy. They hung him to a tree. That colored boy ain't said a thing, but we all should be free. Yes, ma'am, we all should be free. Not meaning to be sassy and not meaning to be smart, but sometimes I think that white folks just ain't got no heart. No, ma'am, just ain't got no heart. Daddy-O Buddy-O works at the foundry. Daddy-O Buddy-O rides the State Street streetcar, transfers to the west side. Polish, Bohunk, Irish, grabs a load of sunrise as he rides out on the prairie. Never knew DuSable, has a lunch to carry. Iron lifting iron makes iron of chocolate muscles. Iron lifting iron makes hammer beat of drum beat, and the heat molds and melts and molds it on red heart, become an anvil, until a glow is lighted in the eyes once soft benighted, and the cotton field is frightened 1,000 miles away. They draw up restrictive covenants in Australia too, they say. Our president takes up important matters still left by VJ Day. Congress cases Russia. The Tribune's hair turns gray. Daddy-O Buddy-O signs his name in uphill letters on the check that is his pay. But if he wasn't in a hurry, he wouldn't write so bad that way, Daddy-O. A great many of my characters and situations in my books come out of Harlem Live. The emotions in a number of my poems are the emotions of the Harlem people. They come from communities where schooling has often been very poor. They themselves may be, and very often are, quite bright men and women, but their backgrounds academically hasn't been of the best. And they bring to Harlem with them many of the problems and prejudices of the Old South. They also bring sometimes a quite rich and somewhat different vocabulary. And it's this vocabulary and this way of talking that people seem to like. Much of the material from my simple stories comes from things that I actually overhear in the street, in cafes, sometimes even at home. Recently I wrote a little simple sketch which grew out of something that my uncle-in-law said one day. They were talking around the dinner table about people going to heaven, and he said, every time I hear of anybody going to heaven, he always wants to sit on the right hand of God. He said, the right hand must be so crowded, can't anybody else get on there? When I get to heaven, he said, I'm going to run right straight toward the left because I know there's plenty of room. So I took that and developed a little simple story from it. When I get on the A train and get back to 125th Street and come out and look around, and there I am in the middle of great, big, black, beautiful Harlem, I'm happy. You know the famous Duke Ellington song, Take the A Train? Well, if you get on that A train on the 8th Avenue subway, if you get on, say, at 42nd Street, you will find perhaps that 2/3 of the passengers on that particular train are colored. When that train gets to 125th Street, about half of them get out. When it gets to the next stop, most of the others get out. From there on, the train will have very few colored people on it to the end of its run. Now, white New Yorkers live largely south of Harlem and north of Harlem. Those who live north of Harlem have to go under Harlem to get home, and sometimes those travelers never see Harlem at all because they only go under it, and a great many people in New York have never even visited Harlem. Mama, please brush off my coat. I'm going down the street. Where are you going, daughter? To see my sugar sweet. Who is your sugar, honey? Turn around. I'll brush behind. He is that young man, Mama, I can't get off my mind. Daughter, once upon a time, let me brush the hem. Your father, yes, he was the one. I felt that way about him. But it was a long time ago. He up and went his way. I hope that wild young son of a gun rots in hell today. Mama, Dad couldn't be still young. He was young yesterday. He was young when he... Turn around so I can brush your back, I say. I woke up this morning about 3:30. All the women's in town was gathered round me. Sweet gals was a-moaning, Sylvester's gonna die. and 100 pretty mamas bowed their heads to cry. I woke up a little later, about 4:30. Doctor and undertakers both at my door. Black gals was a-begging, "You can't leave us here." Brown skins crying, "Daddy, honey, baby, don't go, dear." But I felt my times a-comin', and I knowed I was dying fast. I seed the River Jordan a-creepin' muddy past. But I still sweet Papa Vester, yes, sir, long as life do last. So I hollers, "Come here, babies, for to love your daddy right." And I reaches up to hug 'em when the Lord put out the light. Then everything was darkness in a great big night. There are certain disadvantages in living in a racially unified area. Some of the disadvantages are that sometimes we feel we don't get the full civic services that other communities get. Sometimes if the garbage isn't collected on time, we're inclined to blame it on color and say, oh, well, they don't collect Negroes' garbage. But I think by and large, Harlem lives very much like the rest of New York City. One of the interesting things about Harlem to me as a writer, however, is that I would think about 75% of the people there are roomers. As such, they don't have very much space oftentimes. Whole families, mother and father and 2 or 3 children, live in 2 or 3 rooms, usually sometimes not more than 2 rooms, you know, and sometimes children grow up in rooms rather than in homes. Well, on the other hand, up on Sugar Hill, where the big, beautiful apartment houses are, where people live like Rose Morgan, the woman who has the wonderful beauty establishments, the Rosemeda establishments, where Joe Louis used to live, up there, life is very much the same as it would be on Central Park West. We are the American heartbreak, the rock on which freedom stubbed its toe, the great mistake that Jamestown made long ago. That is one of my poems about the problems of the Negro people in relation to American democracy. Perhaps we should say the problems of American democracy in relation to the Negro people, because for some reason the Negro in America has always been called a problem. Well, I guess we are. Many of my poems try to capture various aspects of this problem. I've written poems about housing. For example, when Negroes move into some American communities, even if it's just one Negro family moving into a block, within a few days, signs begin to go up for sale. And usually, the real estate brokers who handle the sales double the prices on those houses because they know that Negro people often have a hard time buying decent homes, and so they charge them more for the homes that eventually they are willing to sell them. Well, I try to put these things, these problems, into poetry. In recent years, more and more Americans have been leaving the big cities for suburban areas, and among them have been a number of Negroes who are able to buy homes in the suburbs. Well, Negroes move to, let's say, St. Albans. White people flee from St. Albans, move a little further out on Long Island. Negroes, those of means, then themselves try to move a little further out on Long Island. White people flee a little further. And after a while, you know, you get to the ocean. So I suppose that suburbia eventually will be only in the sea. I don't know where else it could be, around New York at any rate. White coats, white aprons, white dresses, white shoes, pain and a learning to take away to Alabama, practice on a State Street cancer, practice on a stockyards rupture, practice on the small appendix of 26 girl at the corner, learning skills of surgeons brown and wonderful with longing to cure ills of Africa, democracy, and mankind. Also ills quite common among all who stand on 2 feet. Brown hands, black hands, golden hands in white coat, nurse's hands on suture, miracle maternity, pain on hind legs rising, pain tamed and subsiding like a mule broke to the halter. Charities checked money, aids triumphant entry squalling after bitter thrust of bearing chocolate and blood. Projection of a day. Tears of joy and Coca-Cola twinkle on the rubber gloves he's wearing. A crown of sweat gleams on his forehead. In the white moon of the amphitheater, magi are staring. The light on the Palmolive building shines like a star in the east. Nurses turn glass doorknobs, opening into corridors. A mist of iodine and ether follows the young doctor. Cellophane's his long stride. Cellophane's his future. In my poetry, I've never been at a loss for moving subject matter because I myself have faced many of these racial problems all over the United States, having lived from one end of the country to the other in my now more than 50 years of life. One of the dramatic ways of expressing the race problem I've found is to express it through the eyes of a child. And I have done this in both stories and poetry. One of my best-known stories is a story called One Friday Morning about a Negro high school girl who is awarded a prize in high school and then is denied the prize when some of the community organizations object to a Negro child receiving it. One of my poems most widely reprinted is a poem about a little colored girl, a poem called Merry-Go-Round, which was written during the war. There was quite a large migration of Negro workers from the South to northern industrial centers during and after the last war, and I imagined a family in which there was a little girl of maybe 6 or 7 years of age moving to a town like Detroit, the father perhaps coming to work in the automobile plants there, coming from maybe a state like Mississippi where segregation is legal. This little child in this northern industrial town one day goes to a carnival. She sees the merry-go-round going around and she wants to ride, but being a very little girl and colored and remembering the segregations of the South, she doesn't quite know whether Negro children can ride on merry-go-rounds in the North or not, and if they can ride, she doesn't know where. Where is the Jim Crow section on this merry-go-round, mister? 'Cause I want to ride. Down south where I come from, white and colored can't sit side by side. Down south on the train, there's a Jim Crow car. On the bus, we're put in the back. But there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. Where's a horse for a kid that's black? They took me out to some lonesome place. They said, "Do you believe in the great white race?" I said, "Mister, to tell you the truth, I'd believe in anything if you just turned me loose." The white man said, "Boy, can it be you are standing there assassin me?" They hit me in the head and knocked me down, and then they kicked me on the ground. A Klansman said, "Listen, look me in the face and tell me you believe in the great white race." The lazy, laughing South with blood on its mouth. The sunny-faced South, be strong, idiot-brained. The child-minded South, scratching in the dead fire's ashes for a Negro's bones. Cotton and the moon, warmth, earth, warmth, the sky, the sun, the stars, the magnolia-scented South, beautiful like a woman, seductive as a dark-eyed whore, passionate, cruel, honey-lipped, syphilitic. That is the South. And I, who am black, would love her, but she spits in my face. And I, who am black, would give her many rare gifts, but she turns her back upon me. So now I seek the north, the cold-faced north, for she, they say, is a kinder mistress, and in her house my children may escape the spell of the south. I am your son, white man. Georgia dusk in the Turpentine woods, one of the pillars of the temple fell. You are my son like hell. The moon over the Turpentine woods, the southern night full of stars, great big yellow stars. What's a body but a toy? Juicy bodies of nigger wenches, blue-black against black fences. Oh, you little bastard boy, what's a body but a toy? The scent of pine wood stings the soft night air. What's the body of your mother? Silver moonlight everywhere. What's the body of your mother? Sharp pine scent in the evening air. A nigger night, a nigger joy, a little yellow bastard boy. No, you ain't my brother. Niggers ain't my brother. Not ever. Niggers ain't my brother. The southern night is full of stars, great big yellow stars. Oh, sweet as earth, dust dark bodies give sweet birth to little yellow bastard boys. Get on back there in the night. You ain't white. The bright stars scatter everywhere, pine wood scent in the evening air. A nigger night, a nigger joy. I am your son, white man, a little yellow bastard boy. I walked the streets till the shoes wore off my feet. I don't walk the streets till the shoes wore off my feet. I've been looking for a job so that I could eat. I couldn't find no job, so I went to the WPA. Couldn't find no job, so I went to the WPA. WPA man told me, you got to live here a year and a day. A year and a day, Lord, in this great big lonesome town. A year and a day in this great big lonesome town. I might starve for a year, but that extra day would get me down. The folks with no titles in front of their names all over the world are raring up and talking back to the folks called Mister. You say you thought everybody was called Mister? No, son, not everybody. Down south in Dixie, often they won't call Negroes Mister. In China, before what happened, they had no intention of calling coolies Mister. Dixie to Singapore, Cape Town to Hong Kong, the misters won't call lots of other folks Mister. They call them, hey, George, here, Sally, listen, coolie, hurry up, boy, and things like that. George Sally Coolie Boy gets tired sometimes. So all over the world today, folks with not even Mister in front of their names are raring up and talking back to those called Mister. From Harlem past Hong Kong to Cape Town, talking back. Shut up, says old Senator Eastland. Shut up, says the governor of South Carolina. Shut up, says the governor of Singapore. Shut up, says Ververd. Hell no, shut up, say the people with no titles in front of their names. Hell no. It's time to talk back now. History says it's time. And the radio, too, foggy with propaganda that says a mouthful and don't mean half of what it says. But it's true anyhow. Liberty, freedom, democracy. True anyhow, no matter how many liars use those words. The people with no titles in front of their names hear those words and shout them back at the misters, lords, generals, viceroys, governors of South Carolina, Eastlands, Ververds. Shut up, people. Shut up, shut up. Shut up, George. Shut up, Sally. Shut up, coolie. Shut up, Indian. Shut up, boy. George, Sally, coolie, Indian boy. Black, brown, yellow, bent down, working, earning riches for the whole world with no title in front of name. Just man, woman, tired, says, no, shut up. Hell no, shut up. So naturally, there's trouble in these our times because of people with no titles in front of their names. I know I am the Negro problem, being wined and dined, answering the usual questions that come to white mind which seek demurely to probe in polite way the why and wherewithal of darkness, USA, wondering how things got this way. In current democratic night, murmuring gently over Fraise du Bois, I'm so ashamed of being white. The lobster is delicious, the wine divine, and center of attention at the dumbest table, mine. To be a problem on Park Avenue at 8 is not so bad. Solutions to the problem, of course and anyhow, must wait. In the quarter of the Negroes, Belgium shadows Leopold, Premier Downing aging, General Bourse beleaguered, Eastland and Vervoer deceased. Dead or alive, their ghosts cast shadows in the quarter of the Negroes, where Negroes sing so well. Negroes sing so well, sing so well, so well. Well? They asked me right at Christmas if my blackness would it rub off. I said, ask your mama. In the quarter of the Negroes, answer questions answer, and answers with a question. And the Talmud is corrected by a student with a fez, who is to Jesuit as North Pole is to South, or Ezekwe to Alabama, or Sammy Davis to the Met, La Scala. Hip boots deep in the blues, and I never had a hip boot on. Hair blowing back in the wind, and I never had that much hair. Diamonds in pawn, and I never had a diamond in my natural life. Me in the White House, and ain't never had a black house. Do, Jesus, Lord, amen. Dreams and nightmares. Nightmares, dreams. Oh, dreaming that the Negroes of the South have taken over, voted all the Dixiecrats right out of power. Comes the colored hour. Martin Luther King is governor of Georgia. Dr. Roy Wilkins, his chief advisor. Zelma Watson George, the high grand worthy. In white-pillared mansions, sitting on their wide verandas, wealthy Negroes have white servants. White sharecroppers work the black plantations, and colored children have white mammies. Mammy Faubus, Mammy Eastland, Mammy Talmadge, Mammy Wallace. Dear, dear, darling old white mammies, sometimes even buried with our family. Dear old Mammy Faubus, dear old Mammy Wallace. Culture, they say, is a two-way street. Hand me my mint julep, Mammy. Hurry up. Make haste.